Welcome to Brain Vision.
In question 6, we're being told that in the early 80s, new legislation allowed banks to pay interest on checking deposits, which they could not do previously. Part A of the question says, if we define money to include checking deposits, what effect did this legislation have on money demand? Explain. Well, let's think about it for a second. Under this new legislation, the interest paid on checking deposits goes from zero into positive territory. And this means that the return to money relative to other financial assets, such as stocks and bonds, increases. Therefore, people would be more willing to increase their money holdings in order to be able to save more and earn some interest. And this, in turn, means that money demand will increase unambiguously. All right. Part B of the question says, if the Federal Reserve had maintained a constant money supply in the face of this change, what would have happened to the interest rate? What would have happened to aggregate demand and aggregate output? To answer that question, we'll resort to a familiar supply and demand graph in the money market. On the x-axis, we have quantity of money M. On the y-axis, we have our interest rate R. We're being told that money supply is fixed by the central bank at M1, M1S. And as we explained before, money demand will increase from M1D to M2D, and therefore the equilibrium interest rate will be higher. R2 is higher than R1. Now, what is the effect of a higher interest rate on the macroeconomy? Well, if we think about it, a higher interest rate has two directly negative effects on aggregate demand. First, a higher interest rate lowers the incentives for consumption, since people would be more willing to save some of the money rather than spend it all away because they're earning some interest. And second, there's also a negative effect on investment, since businesses will be less willing to invest because they're facing a higher interest rate, which makes it more difficult to get a loan and invest in a project. Therefore, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left, and the intersection of 82 with the unaffected, of course, aggregate supply curve will result in a lower output, Y2. And also the price level will also drop, even though we're not asked. The question doesn't ask for the price level, but it will also drop to P2 right here. All right. Part C of the question says, if the Fed had maintained a constant market interest rate in the face of this change, what change in the money supply would have been necessary? What would have happened to aggregate demand and aggregate output? Now we have the inverse scenario where the central bank tries to maintain the interest rate R1. However, as we showed before, the economy is operating at R2, which is higher than R1. And so what does the Fed need to do? They need to increase their money supply from M1S to M2S, because the new money supply curve intersects the money demand curve at the lower range. So we're back to the initial interest rate R1. So what happens in the aggregate demand curve? Well, it will be unaffected because there will be a very, very short term deviation from the initial interest rate. The aggregate supply curve, of course, is not affected by such changes. So we are at the same level of output, Y1.